into the study, first do a little bit of a review of where we have been and what we've gone through thus far with Joshua. Okay, so we looked at Joshua chapters 1 through 4, and what we noticed, what we recognized, what we went through there was Joshua taking over as the leader of Israel. And not only that, but we see that there were spies that were sent out to Jericho. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this land that the spies went to. They went to Jericho and spied it out, and all those types of things. And we talked about the crossing over of the Jordan River. We got into Joshua chapter 5, and we noticed and we recognized that they conquered Jericho and then took Ai. And then last time, on Wednesday, we spent time going through Joshua 9 through 12. And this was really the conquest, if you will. Okay, we think of Joshua, we think about the conquest, them going throughout the land and taking it through various battles and whatnot. That's really 5 through 8 and 9 through 12 that we see. And last time we spoke in a little bit of detail about the battles and some that were there and how they occurred and the different things that happened. And whenever we got to the end of Joshua chapter 12, that's where we left off with, they have conquered this land, and now it's time they conquered at least a portion of the land, as we'll see in a minute, but now it's time for the division or the dividing up of the land, and we're going to get in that today. So an overview of the text that we're going to be going through. First of all, like I said, we're going to be going through 13 through 17. We look at Joshua chapter 13, what we recognize and what we're going to see throughout this chapter is the land divided that was to the east of the Jordan River. Now, there's some other things there, but chapter 13, there's a lot of it dealing with the land divided to the east of the Jordan River. And this was land that Moses had given, and so we'll get into that. And then we get into Joshua chapter 14, land divided to the west of the Jordan. And that's going to be one that Joshua and others divide up amongst the remaining tribes of Israel. We get into chapter 15. We're going to see in particular the land of Judah and its inheritance. And then 16 through 17, really looking at the land of Ephraim and Manasseh. Those are the children of Joseph that are split up into two separate allotments, if you will. And so these are the types of things that we're going to recognize. If you have a text or a scripture or something you want to look at as far as a theme for this section, God telling Joshua to divide this land as an inheritance. And that's the point that we get to. And so we're going to recognize some of this area, some of this territory as we go throughout, and also some of the other things that are there with Caleb and others, and make some application there with that. So, Joshua 13. Joshua chapter 13. Before we get into this aspect of the land and how it was divided on the other side of the Jordan, right, on the eastern side, which would have been done by Moses, we first have this aspect here in 13 of God talking with Joshua and telling him what needs to be done. First of all, we notice something. Actually, you know what? I want to start off with number 1 in your lesson books on answer plainly in a few words. Give the borders of the land which is counted, reckoned to the Canaanites. Did you guys get on that? Larry?
All the borders of the Philistines and all the Shuri.
Okay, very good. And so one of the things, and so there's some area through here that we see that had not been conquered, if you will. In other words, on the conquest of whenever they come in and they take Jericho, and then they take Ai, and then as we talked last time, they go down here, conquer the Southland, have battles through here, and then they go up in the Northland, have some battles through there. Here on the eastern side of the Jordan River, it had already been taken before they crossed the Jordan. Who was still alive whenever this land was done? Okay, Moses. So this land right here in some of this, and let me say this about my maps beforehand, okay? I searched Google for them, and I found the best ones that I could find, okay? There might be some disparities here or there, different things like that, but these are going to be, I believe, within range of the things that are talked about in Scripture. And so this is about the territory that we're talking about. is there still land that was promised that had not been conquered yet? Yes. Okay? And that's what's being told to Joshua at this point. What's being told is, hey, there's still some land, right? There's still some land through here and other areas that had not been conquered yet. But what does he say about Joshua? He's old. And so what needs to happen? Not all of it have we gone through with an army and conquered all of these, okay? But you're old, and because you're getting older in age, what is something that needs to happen with this land? A lot. It needs to be divided up. And so what we have here in through 13 through 17, and it's also going to carry on into our next lesson on Wednesday, is the dividing up of that land. Joshua's getting older, and so it's to the point now where he's like, okay, let's go through and let's get this land divided up, okay? It was something that Joshua was to do. Now, with that said, he tells Joshua that he needs to go through and he needs to divide up the land. And I'm trying to remember if it's here or if it's in 14, okay? I think it's actually in 14 whenever he talks about the other 9.5 tribes. But the bottom line is, we've already talked about this land right here has been conquered. Has it been divided up? It has. Who was the one that divided it? Who was alive? Who did that? Who set that up or did that, I guess, while he was alive? That was Moses, right? Who were the 2 tribes? 2.5. My apologies. Who are the 2.5? Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Okay, and again, Manasseh is a son of Joseph, right? And we're going to get into Ephraim and Manasseh. So at this point, what we're seeing here in in chapter 13 is basically this. Okay, you have crossed over, you've gone through, and you've conquered this land. This land over here on the eastern side has already been conquered. This land's already been divided. Now, it does in the back half of chapter 13, after God talks with Joshua, does go through, because he does say, I misspoke earlier, it does actually say here in chapter 13, verse 7, now therefore divide this land as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. And that's because it needs to be divided up as not been, but this portion has. Okay? So, we recognize that this land now needs to be divided up. This over here has already been divided, right? We just stated, you have Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Now it's pointed out their divisions and their markings and their territories in verse 8 through the end of the chapter. Is really going through and talking about what Moses has already done. Not that it needs to be redone, right? East of the Jordan's already been divided up. Moses has already divided up. It's already been done. And so that's pointed out here. But there's also something else pointed out in chapter 13. And it's also pointed out at the very beginning of chapter 14, and that's regarding the Levites. Because whenever you look at the land, and this is it in its totality, and so we're going to see that as we go on into Wednesday. As you look at the land, is there a tribe that is missing from an allotment, if you will? Yeah, Levi. And why is that? What's pointed out in Scripture? Jason?
If they had their own land that they were confined to, they wouldn't have been able to carry out their jobs and duties that God had intended for them to carry out. So the way that it was, they were able to occupy the whole area.
Yeah, that's right. What was the job or the duties that was given to Levi, to the Levites?
The offerings of fire to the Lord was their inheritance.
Okay, very good. The offerings to the Lord, the fire, that was their inheritance. They were servants of the Lord, right? That's pointed out in chapter 13, verse 14. Again in verse 33, pointing out that the Lord was their inheritance. And then you even get into chapter 14, verses 3 through 4, talks about that no part was given to the Levites as an inheritance, right? As a land inheritance, if you will. There is something pointed out, though, about the Levites in chapter 14, verse 3, and what is that? Say that again, Steve. Okay, very good. So they had various cities. So they didn't have necessarily land or allotment in the sense that we see with all the rest. But what do they have? It goes back to Jason's point. It's not like they were nomads. They still had somewhere to dwell, and this allowed them to dwell throughout, right? And to carry out the duties that were there. And so we recognize that. That's one of the things that's pointed out throughout this section of Scripture regarding Levi and the Levites. But really going through chapter 13, what we recognize is, Joshua, you're old. You've conquered various areas, and various areas have been conquered. There's still more that needs to be given. Okay? There's still more that is going to be given. And one of the things that's pointed out, I meant to point this out earlier, is in verse 6 regarding that statement that God has made. Okay? You're old, but, and this land needs to be divided up, right? But all the inhabitants of the mountains and all these areas, God says, I will drive out from before the children of Israel, only divide it by lot to Israel as an inheritance, as I have commanded you. So, in other words, it has not been conquered. We're going to divide it up by lot right now, but is God going to fall short of the fulfillment of his promise? No. He's still saying that promise that was given, it's still going to come to fruition fully. And we're going to see that as we continue on throughout Joshua. I believe it's actually in 21 is whenever we get to the point it's stated that all has been fulfilled as far as the land promise goes. And so we see that going throughout. Okay? I got one more point that I want to make here in chapter 13, but before I do, does anybody have anything that they want to say so far?
Well, this idea of taking over the land and conquering it and actually possessing it slower than perhaps what they might have expected, that was told to them way back in Exodus. Right. God said, I'm going to give you the promised land, but there are reasons why I'm not going to have you possess it all at once.
Right.
So we don't know the exact timeline of where they moved and how long it took them to get there and possess it and conquer it, etc. But we know eventually in God's time it's going to happen.
That's right. That's right. And it's one of those lessons and one of those things that we see regarding faithfulness of God. Whenever he says it, we talked about this a little bit last time, right? Whenever they were going to fight some of their battles, God said, I've already delivered them in your hands. Whenever God says it, you can be assured that it's going to happen, right? It's already as good as done whenever it is said. And so we recognize that as we go through this study. Now, one of the things that I just wanted to point out quickly, and we don't need to get into it in too much detail because honestly it doesn't get into it in a whole lot of detail here. But how was the land divided? How was it decided? By lot. Okay. By casting of lots. Now, how exactly did they do that? In other words, what was that process of the casting lots here in particular? We're not given any of that. But what do we know regarding the casting of lots? What was it there for? What did it do? Kurt?
It's a way for God to communicate his intention and yet give the responsibility to Joshua to make sure that it was done.
Who commanded it to be done that way? Who commanded it to be done by lots? God had, right? It was one of the things that God said, and we know that it said that Joshua and Moses both, that whenever they divided up the land, how did they do it? As God had commanded. So they did it the way that God commanded. And we know, going back to the statement that Kurt was making regarding the casting of lots, this is something that's going to be done and that we see done here. We see it also done in the New Testament, right? In Acts chapter 1. In what case did they cast lots there? What was going on? What decision was being made at that point in time? Okay, right? The replacement of Judas, right? And so we see it. We see it's something that's scriptural. We see it's done whenever an important decision, a very important decision, needs to be made. And it's something where it is done. I believe it's in, I think I wrote it down in Proverbs that talks about the casting of lots. Yeah, Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast. I believe it says the lot is cast on the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And so we get that idea, that understanding of what casting lots was. It was an important decision that needed to be made. And it was a decision in which we see God giving that answer of what needs to be done in this case. So who gives the land? God gives the land. Where does the inheritance come from? We see that God has a role to play in that as well. Exactly how was that done with the casting lots? In other words, how was the lot cast, all that? We're not given that information, but what we are given is that God has a hand to play in this. Scott?
God's given them the land as a gift. And it's obvious it's His power doing it because they're taking 2,000 people and conquering many more. But He's got requirements that they must follow to inherit it. And it's the same with, heaven. We're given heaven as a gift. But we have requirements that we must do to obtain it. So, there's always, do we deserve it? No. But we have to do things there's requirements. And that's what you see. He could have snapped his fingers and either everybody ran out of that country or died. But that's not how He wants things done.
Yeah, you go back really even to the beginning of Joshua and even further back than that as the land was promised them and you got Moses and then Joshua taking over and all those types of things. God states multiple times, if you do what I tell you to do, you're going to receive this land and I'm going to be with you. And it's one of the things that we see throughout the conquest as we talked about last time. But then even whenever we get into and start thinking about the dividing up of the land, Joshua's continuing to be one who is obedient to God in how he does things, doing it the way that God told him to. One of the other things that's pointed out here in chapter 13, and it's also going to be pointed out with Judah, and it's also going to be pointed out with Ephraim and others, is some of the peoples of the land. Okay? Some of the peoples of the land that was in the various areas here, okay, what happened to them? We know some of them were conquered and killed. Were all of them completely driven out, completely gotten rid of to where there was no those who previously occupied the land left? No, what happened to some of them? Yeah, some of them, as is stated, remain there. Right? They're still there. Some of them and I'm making this point now so we don't have to go back every single time and make the same point because it says this a couple different times. One with here with on the eastern side of the Jordan and then again with Judah and others. But it says that they were there to this day. There were those who were enslaved and different things like that. Okay, we see that they were there, that they were in the land. Does this eventually become a problem? Yes, it does. Right? And it doesn't necessarily get into this lesson, okay? So that's not the point of going in all the details and everything that happens, but it's at this point that we see that they weren't completely driven out. And one of the things that is stated about it is that they didn't drive them all the way out. There's even the statement that they couldn't drive them out. What do you mean they couldn't drive them out? Was there some force that was keeping them from driving them out? Was there some power that was keeping them? I don't believe that that's the case. Right? It can't possibly be the case whenever you're going to be consistent with Scripture and we know the power that is behind them and the ability to. The bottom line is, what did they not do? It didn't drive them fully out. There were those that were left around. And does this become a problem? And so everyone's shaking their head. Yes, we know it becomes a problem. We know it's a problem as time goes on for the children of Israel, right? That they are influenced by those that were left and all those types of things, okay? And so we see that and we recognize the issue that's there, and it really kind of starts back here. We know that eventually these all become a problem, and I guess here's one of the points that I'm trying to make. Eventually these become a problem, okay? They have an influence on Israel and all those types of things. And while those had the ability to make the choice not to be influenced by them, that still doesn't change the fact that there was a choice that was made to allow them to be there to potentially have that influence. Everyone has choices that they can make. in their life whenever they're in a given situation. But there are some times that your choices can affect generations down the line and make things potentially more difficult and those types of things. And so we see that, Rick was speaking this morning on choices. We see the impact of a choice to make for whatever reason to allow these to stay in the land. Yes, Rick, sorry.
If you look at Judges chapter 1, verse 28,
Mm-hmm.
it said, "It came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out." So they had a different plan than God's plan.
That's right. That's a really good point and a really good way of looking forward and seeing really what was going on, right? They had a different plan than God's plan. Some might say that they compromised to an extent, right? All those types of things come into play, and we need to understand the consequences of potential choices that we make. Now, I don't want to make anyone lead to believe that if you make a choice, you can never be forgiven of that choice. You can't ever be right with God again. But the fact is, there is consequences to choices. That is the point that I'm trying to make, and that we really see the start of it right here, okay? Whenever in the dividing up of the land and the giving of the land. Scott?
Somewhere I remember reading where there's a group that needs more land, and he says, "Well, go up to the hill country and take it." And they're like, "Well, there's giants up there."
That's right.
And it's got a bunch of trees, and he's restated, go up there, conquer it, and clear the trees out.
That's right. We're going to get that. We're going to get to that at the very end. I mean, that's really with Ephraim and Manasseh, right? They come and say, "We need more land. We don't have enough. We're too great of a people." In other words, we got too many, and our allotment's too small. And he's like, "Well, go up there and go conquer it." And they give excuses as to why. And from Scripture, we don't really ever get anything that says that they actually did what Joshua told them to do. And we see that. We see that. Not necessarily complacency, but certainly some compromise and some reasoning within our own mind as to why we can't do it and why we don't do that. And we see that here with them, and we can certainly make that application to our life. All right, so we then get into Joshua 14. Okay? And Joshua 13, like I said, it's really talking about what had already been divided up on the eastern side. It's talking about the fact that the Levites have their inheritance, which is the Lord. They're not going to have their own land. And so we get into chapter 14, and this is really where we start to see some of the dividing up of the land to the west of the Jordan. Who was instrumental? Who led in this dividing up of the land, if you will? We've kind of already stated this, but I'm getting to this point now, so I'm trying to stay with my outline and my notes. But who did it? Larry? Joshua. Okay, very good. It was Joshua. Was Joshua alone in this? Like, was he the only one that was a part of heading that up? Who else do we read was there as well? Eleazar the priest, and then the fathers of the tribes. And so we see some of that going on. Now, one of the things that we do want to point out is what we read in verse 5. And we've kind of stated this before throughout this lesson, but as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land. And so, as the Lord had commanded, they're going to divide up the land. Now, it states in chapter 14, 1 through 5, talking about the land of the west of the Jordan, and we need to divide it up amongst the rest of the tribes. The 9.5 that have not received their inheritance, we need to divide that up. But within this, and before we get to 15, and they get into the land of Judah, which we'll talk about in a minute down here, there is a discourse here, a conversation in chapter 14 with Caleb and Joshua. Caleb coming to Joshua, right? And why did Caleb come to Joshua?
Because of the promise that was made back when he was faithful.
Okay, very good. The promise was made back whenever he spied out the land, right? You guys, I believe you would have gone through that, right? Did you guys go through all that prior to this class? Did you guys talk about that? Okay, thank you. At least I saw Harry shaking his head, right? So Numbers chapter 14, right? And you guys know the story, but in Numbers chapter 14, what happened? Okay, very good. So 12 spies were sent. 10 of them came back. What did they say? We can't do it. And whenever they did that, what did that cause to happen amongst the congregation? Say that again.
Fear and grumbling and melting of heart.
Okay, very, very, very good. Fear, grumbling, melting of the heart. In fact, melting of the heart is specifically what Caleb states here, right? There were those that came back and they caused others to melt in the heart. They were fearful of the situation, right? Who were the two that stood up and said, we can? Joshua and Caleb, right? And why did they say that they could? Why did they believe that they could go take the land? You had 10 that couldn't, right? We were like ants in their eyes, all these types of things. We can't go take it. I mean, it's a great land. We can't take it. Why Joshua and Caleb say they could? Yeah, God's with us. God's behind us. God said that we can do it. We can do it, right? And so because of that, Caleb is alluding to the fact of, hey, whenever that happened and whenever that occurred, there was this land that was promised to me. What statement did he make? And this is number 6 on the true and false, really. But what statement did Caleb make regarding what he did and why it was commanded or promised to him that he would be given Samaria, that his feet had trodden on? He wholly followed the Lord. He wholly followed the Lord. What does that mean? Holy, W-H-O, right? What does that mean?
Without fail, he didn't falter.
Okay, very good. He didn't falter. He fully did it. He fully followed the Lord and did what he was commanded to do. And as a result of that, this land was promised to him. Now, whenever he had that conversation with Caleb, what did Caleb say? That land, did he say, well, no, you know what, things have changed. Huh? Say that again, DJ?
Continue.
I think I know what you said, and we will get to that here in a minute. Okay, no, you're fine, Eric.
If you notice what Caleb does, he does the exact opposite that later on Ephraim and Manasseh do. He asked for the land that had the Anakim, or the giants in it. That was what scared everybody at first. Caleb wasn't scared by that. And he asked to have that part where they're the very strongest.
Yeah.
And where, as it goes on to talk about Arba, the strongest man among them was the strong man of the place that he was going to go to have as his home.
That's right.
And you see a great difference between Caleb and how he approached it as a leader there of Judah, and how the leaders in Ephraim and Manasseh, they wanted a land that was easy without any of those big impediments.
That's right. And you know what you see, and so I mean, it kind of cuts from here, starts in chapter 15 talking about Judah, and then it comes back, I guess, if you will, to Caleb and exactly what he did, right? Where did Caleb go? This is to Harry's point. He went and he conquered them, right? He went to this area that he was asking for to be given. He went to Hebron, which, if we get over here into this map, is down in this area. And so he came down, and there were 3 sons that were there, right? And he drove them out and conquered them. And as Harry pointed out, and as Scripture points out, not only did he drive these out and conquer them, but it wasn't like it was just some pushover army that was left, if you will. It was one of the strong ones that was left. And this goes back to, I believe, the point that DJ was making. DJ, you said something about him being strong, right? What did he say about it?
He's just strong now as he was then.
I'm just as strong now as I was then. How old was he then? 40. How old is he now? I'm just as strong. What did I say, 45?
I did.
Oh, you
45 years.
Man, you like messed me up, man. All right, so he's 85. So 45 years, right? 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness that had to occur and did occur. So all the rest of that generation wouldn't enter into the land, but those who did were Joshua and Caleb. They're older now, right? And obviously it's mentioned that Joshua, you're older. It's mentioned, and Caleb mentions, hey, I'm 85, but you know what? I'm just as strong now as I was then, okay? Now, could his body have been just as strong? Could he have been in as good a physical shape? I doubt it. Doesn't mean he was in bad physical shape. But I believe it's an allusion to what? Right. Look, not only was I faithful then, I've been faithful through this time, and I'm still faithful now. These that are here in this land, they're going to be driven out. And then we read in chapter 15 that that's exactly what happens, right? He goes in and he drives them out. You know, we see that with Caleb. You know, we think about Joshua and Caleb, and we know the account there in chapter 14 of Numbers, and we look at it and we study it quite a bit, and then we read a lot about Joshua because there's a book named after him and all the conquests and the conquering that he did there. Don't forget about Caleb either. An example of enduring faithfulness, an example of staying faithful to the Lord all the way through. You think about that too. From the time that they went and spied out the land to the time that they finally came in, and now Caleb is ready to go and not just receive his inheritance, but continue to drive those out from the land. 45 years. 45 years for me is a long time from now, right? I'm going to be almost 80 by that point in time. The patience that Caleb had and the trust that Caleb had to wait on the Lord and be faithful to God through that entire time. Now, that's something that I definitely think that we can take and make application in our life and think about. You know, Caleb was promised this land, but he had to wait all those years. Everybody else wandering in the wilderness, and yet he still remained faithful, and he still believed that God was going to give it to him through all that, and that's exactly what happened. Jason?
I agree with your point, but it's interesting to know about just what was said about the physical part of it, because Moses was 120 when he died,
Right.
and it says that his eye was not dim, and he had not lost any of his strength when he died. So.
Yeah, certainly could. It could be. That is the point, or that was there, and that he was still physically able to go through and do this. Okay? But he said, I think, in line with the thing that he's talking about, and really even going and alluding to the point that Joshua is going to make to Ephraim, is you're a great people and you have power. In other words, there's a power behind you. I believe that's kind of in line with the point. Ephraim didn't recognize or realize or completely comprehend what God had just done in taking of the land, and that they could still do it. And they didn't, from what Scripture says, drive out. They were still fearful of the people with the chariots of iron. Caleb was not. He was on the opposite end of the spectrum on that. So, anything else on that? Caleb goes down and he conquers Hebron, as we see, but there is another aspect to it as you get into Joshua chapter 15. He goes and he conquers another area, and what's that? Or he turns. Scripture talks about the fact that he turns and he starts looking to where? It would be, I believe you say it's Debir. Maybe you say it in a different way. It's Debir. And it would be approximately right in here in this area on the map. Okay? And so he turns and sets his sights there. And what does he say? If anybody goes in, captures it, takes the land, right? Takes it, I'll give him my daughter. Who went and did that? Othniel. And Othniel goes down, he captures it. He, as a result, in return, gets Caleb's daughter as his wife. Then Caleb's daughter, what does she ask for? He asks for springs, and Caleb gives it to her. And so we see that continued push. We see that continued faithfulness and desire that Caleb has shown really throughout his life here as well. And we see it with Othniel and his daughter. So Caleb goes in and Caleb asks for this area of Hebron, and really that kind of sets up all of Judah. Chapter 15 really talks about the inheritance of Judah, the areas that they get. Again, this map, it doesn't show some of this area down in here, okay, but we know Egypt's going to be approximately over in there and those types of things. Judah is going to be at this southern portion of the promised land that was given to them. And we see that it was divided up the lots were cast, and that they got this area and this portion of the land. So Joshua, and it states throughout chapter 15, this area, the borders, it goes through and lists multiple cities that are a part of it and all those types of things. Does anybody have anything of note on the rest of Judah and their inheritance before we go on to 16 and 17 and start talking about Ephraim and Manasseh? Jason?
Just an interesting note for the size of this area. It's not just a vast, large area. The Simeon is about the size of like Oklahoma City with all its suburbs and Edmonds and Yukons. That's about how big that area is that we're talking about.
Yeah, very good. This is definitely zoomed in, right? Zoomed in on that land, not zoomed out, showing the whole area, whole region of the Middle East, if you will. We know that. So good point. I appreciate that. Kurt?
Well, I'm afraid that as a spoiler, if we go to the first chapter of Judges, there's kind of a synopsis of how all of this went. We see that a lot of the final story was that the tribes did not. We have scripture after scripture. Manasseh did not drive out. Ephraim did not drive out. Zebulun did not drive out. And so we know that God had the power. He had already told the people what was going to happen, and yet it didn't happen. Well, does that mean that God failed? No, that means that man failed. That the children of Israel did not have sufficient faith in God to use the power that he offered them, and God allowed them, in effect, to fail because they did not do what they were told. They were disobedient. He does not take over when man is disobedient.
That's a good point as far as the free will of man, right? Man has the ability to make his own choices. God had proved himself throughout the whole time. I mean, coming over and then through going into land, and then like we talked about last time with the conquering of the land, and it was clear and it was very evident that God was one that was driving these people out from the standpoint as he had delivered them into their hands. All they had to do was have the courage and boldness to go do it. And they failed to do that. And it's a lesson that, man has free will, that God still is faithful to his promises. Man has their role to play. And one of the things that, we need to take and make application of as well is we see, we look at these and like, how could they not do that? They just saw what God did for them in all these battles when they're going through and conquering Ai and Jericho and even going down into the Southland and the Northland, that God had delivered them into their hands. How come they didn't just keep on? Why did they allow these to stay? There was a choice that they made. There was a wrong choice, and we need to understand that we can do the same thing. We can read scripture after scripture, have evidence after evidence that God has given us to show who he is and how much he loves us, how much he cares for us, and how we can have that inheritance of heaven if we would just be obedient to him. And yet there are a lot of times where we fall short as well. So it's really easy to be critical of these, and we have the right to be given the decisions that they make, but take that and make the application to our life. Right? We have the evidences that are here provided for us from Scripture that we need to continue on and make the choices that we need to make. Harry?
Without trying to make a political statement about this, you see something here it's so today, it's been in our history, it's been history everywhere you talk about. When somebody allows an enemy within them, and they don't do anything about that, then sooner or later they learn to have friendships, marriages, all of that with the enemy, and they're no longer seen as an enemy. And the result is they're overcome. We live in what would have been called Indian territory 150 years ago. It's not that, and there's a reason. All of these things that we recognize, when you allow those to come in who have a different set of values and everything else than you do, then sooner or later that's going to take over from within. And you notice that didn't just happen this time. After they had gone through this, now God takes them away into captivity in Assyria and Babylon. They come back and they do the exact same thing again. And it is a powerful statement as to how much we are affected by our surroundings. What Rick pointed out this morning with a lot of various ones. We can say what we want, but if we allow those around us who have different values, worship a different God, do those things that are not right, sooner or later, it's going to have an effect on us or our children or whoever.
That's right. And, you think about that, like I said, a lot of the issues that we see as they really flourish, if you will, are down the line, and they get to the point where they didn't grow up where they were the enemies, right? They'd always just been around, and then the friendships just develop and evolve in that way, and then the influences are there. And we certainly see it being a problem throughout Israelite history, and we really see it started here without them completely doing what they need to do. Now, I know that was the last slide, right? I believe that was it. Just 16 and 17, we jumped ahead of it and already talked about it. It's the land given to Ephraim and the other half of the tribe of Manasseh. It's in this area. The other account or part that I was going to bring out, we already talked about that with what Ephraim and Manasseh did going to Joshua, stating they needed more land. And we see the contrast between them and the way that they were viewing things and the way that Caleb viewed things. And you see the effect and the result of that. All right, next time we're going to be going through Lesson 5, and that's going to be on Wednesday. That's going to be, I believe, 18 through 21, I think. 18 through 21. So prepare for Lesson 5 in your lesson books. Thanks, guys.